They came to study silence, but the silence was already studying them. When the microphone stopped recording, the voices didn't. The Ozark foothills in 1871 were not yet a place for strangers. The land folded in on itself, hills rising like ribs from an old carcass, the hollows between them damp and airless even at noon. Settlers spoke softly there, as if the limestone cliffs might listen. Creeks carved their paths through red clay and vanished into sinkholes without warning. Fog rose early, settled late, and sound seemed to travel wrong farther than it should, but never in the direction it came from. The people who stayed long enough to call it home said the valley had a voice of its own, and that it only ever whispered. On the western slope of those hills stood the Graverly place, though few in the nearby settlement ever claimed to have seen it up close. The cabin sat at the edge of the timberline, its boards warped gray by rain, its windows clouded with the kind of dust that never wiped away. It had been built, they said, not for comfort, but for keeping things in or perhaps out. A narrow trail wound up from the creek to its porch, marked by stones that gleamed pale even under the thick canopy. Some said they were river stones hauled from miles away, though no one ever saw Silas Graverly make the trip. The Graverly family had arrived 3 winters before, traveling by wagon from Tennessee. They claimed a small patch of land too poor for farming and too far for company. Silas was a gaunt man, his eyes deep-set and cautious. His wife, Ruth, kept her shawl drawn even in the heat. Their 3 children were pale things, quiet as snowfall. When they came into town rarely and never together, the children clung to Ruth's skirts, their mouths closed tight. The youngest stared at people's hands instead of faces. They never spoke, not a word, not even a cry. At first, the silence seemed only strange. The hills were full of odd folk who kept to themselves. But it was the way sound carried from the Graverly Ridge that began to turn curiosity into unease. Travelers swore they heard faint voices drifting through the trees at night, soft, rhythmic, as if someone were speaking from deep underground. Others said it was just the wind finding its way through the hollows. Yet even the wind did not move right there. It stopped short near the ridge, as though unwilling to cross it. By summer's end, no one lingered near the Graverly Creek after dark. The woods there had a listening quality, and when the frogs went still, the silence pressed hard against the chest. Sometimes, if you stood long enough, you could almost hear it, something between a hum and a sigh, rising from the earth itself, and if you listened too closely, it began to sound like words. Silas and Ruth Graverly arrived in the Ozarks in the late spring of 1868, their wagon drawn by a mule so thin its ribs clattered when it breathed. The road that led into the hollow was hardly more than 2 ruts between the trees, and by the time they reached the ridge, even the sound of the wheels had gone muffled by moss and dust. They stopped where the creek bent around a limestone bluff and declared it home. No one had ever wanted that patch of ground before. The soil was shallow, the wind sharp in winter, and the sun vanished behind the hills long before evening. But the Graverlys built there anyway, hammering boards by lantern light, never once asking help from the nearby farms. Silas was not a man who spoke freely. When he did, his words came slow, as though each one cost him something to part with. Ruth was softer, but not friendlier. Her face carried the weary kindness of a woman who once believed in better things. The 3 children, 2 girls and a boy, were smaller than their years, each with the same pale hair and hollow eyes. They never laughed, never cried, never spoke. When the eldest, Ada, blinked, it was deliberate, slow, as though her body had to remember how. The middle child, Thomas, stared at the ground as if listening to something beneath it. The youngest, little May, followed every movement with her gaze, birds, falling leaves, the shapes of people passing, but she made no sound, not even when she stumbled. Neighbors who met them in town remembered how the children clung to Ruth's skirts, their eyes shifting together like fish in a pond. The family bought only salt, flour, and lamp oil. They never lingered. When the blacksmith tried to make conversation, Silas simply nodded once and loaded the wagon in silence. By the time he looked up again, the children were already watching him, their heads tilted at the same angle, their expressions unreadable. Whispers began quickly, as they do in places where nights are long. Some said the Graverly children had been struck mute by fever back in Tennessee. Others swore Silas had made a bargain with something in the woods to keep them alive. A few of the older settlers, men who'd lived through war and plague alike, just shook their heads and said certain families carried silence like a curse. At first, their isolation was tolerated. The Ozarks had room enough for all kinds. But it was the stillness that unsettled people the way their cabin gave off no noise at all. No hammering, no singing, no quarrels. Even the livestock seemed subdued around their fence line. Travelers passing through at night claimed that if you stopped by the creek below their house, you could hear soft breathing above the water, as if the woods themselves were holding their breath. Those who lingered said they sometimes saw the children at the edge of the trees, unmoving, watching without blinking, pale shapes half swallowed by the fog, waiting for something no one else could hear. By the time the second autumn settled over the valley, the Graverly children's silence had become more than a curiosity. It had hardened into something like ritual. In a town where gossip filled the air thicker than smoke, no one could quite agree what to make of it. Children were meant to sing, to squabble, to fill the fields with noise, yet the Graverly cabin gave nothing back to the world around it. No laughter through open windows, no arguments. Not even the faint lull of a mother's song. It was as though the place had swallowed sound whole. At church, Ruth Graverly sometimes came alone, her shawl drawn tight, her eyes rimmed in sleepless red. She bowed her head during hymns but never sang. Silas stayed on the ridge, claiming poor health, though his oxen were seen hauling timber in the same hours the bells rang. The children never appeared. When the preacher asked if he might visit to offer prayer, Ruth only shook her head and said softly, "They do not like to be watched." The settlers began to speak of the children in half-believing tones, as one might speak of weather that refused to change. Some said they had been born without tongues, though others insisted their silence was chosen, a pact made between them and something unseen. A woman named Mrs. Cole, who lived nearest the ridge, swore she'd heard voices one night, 3 of them, soft as reeds in water, but when she drew near, she found the cabin dark, every window shuttered. Her husband told her it was the wind, though he didn't meet her eyes when he said it. In town, the story of their muteness grew taller. The blacksmith joked that maybe they spoke in dreams. The storekeeper claimed he'd seen one of them move their lips when no one else was near. But the laughter that followed these tales was thin, uneasy. No one wanted to admit the truth that they were afraid of children who never cried, who never played, who only watched. Ruth's condition worsened as winter approached. Neighbors who brought flour or kerosene saw her thinner each time, her cheeks hollowing, her voice gone to a whisper. One night, a farmhand delivering kindling claimed he'd seen her standing outside the children's door, candle trembling in her hand. She leaned close, speaking in low tones, pleading with words he couldn't catch. When she turned, her face was streaked with tears, and behind her, 3 small shadows stood perfectly still, heads tilted, listening but not answering. From that night on, the cabin's lantern burned later than before. Sometimes, faint scratching sounds came from its upper windows, as though someone inside was trying to write words they could not speak. The neighbors pretended not to hear. They fastened their shutters early, prayed over their doorframes, and told themselves that whatever kept the Graverly children quiet was meant to stay that way. Yet more than one settler, lying awake in the hush before dawn, swore they could hear something on the wind, a soft, stifled hum, like a voice learning, slowly, how to return. Harlan Doss was a man who trusted his own tracks more than any preacher's word. He'd been trapping the Ozark woods for near a decade, a figure the locals knew by the smell of pelts and pipe smoke that trailed him. When word spread that he planned to hunt the holler beyond the Graverly Ridge, most told him to leave that patch alone. Ain't no game worth what walks there, old missus. Cole warned, but Harlan only spat and said there was no hollow god ever made that could scare him. He left before dawn one morning in late October, carrying a trap sack, a skinning knife, and a rifle patched with brass wire. The air that day was heavy, the kind that dulls sound. Harlan followed the creek north, setting traps near the limestone bluffs until he spotted prints in the soft mud, small ones, bare, leading deeper into the trees. He crouched to study them. Child-sized, but the spacing was wrong, the stride uneven, like whoever made them dragged 1 foot through the silt. He told himself it was some settler's kid gone wandering and followed. By sundown, the fog had rolled down from the ridge, thick enough to swallow trees whole. When Harlan didn't return by nightfall, no one worried at first. He'd slept in the woods before, and trappers were a breed that disappeared for days. But when 3 sunsets passed and his mule came back alone, reins tangled, the valley stirred. A search party went out, rifles in hand, calling his name into the fog. They found his boot first, half buried in the creek bed, the leather torn and the heel twisted off. A little farther on, they found his rifle, snapped clean across the stock, as if struck by something harder than wood. The tracks around it were strange, child-sized again, circling the mud in tight spirals before vanishing into the leaves. No body, no blood, just silence and the echo of water moving slow. 2 days later, something changed on the ridge. Mrs. Cole, hanging laundry at dusk, heard a sound rise from the Graverly house. A low, steady hum, like wind caught in a jar. She froze, the sheet twisting in her hands. It wasn't the mother or the father. It was higher, thinner. A girl's voice. It wavered, finding rhythm, dipping low and rising again, almost like it followed a pulse. The sound carried across the hollow, reaching fields, cabins, even the churchyard. Every soul who heard it stopped what they were doing. The Graverly children had never made a sound before. That night, lamps burned in every house, and no one slept easy. The next morning, Silas Graverly was seen walking to town alone. He bought nothing, said nothing, just stood by the store porch staring toward the hills. When he finally spoke, his voice cracked. "She found a tune," he said, and left before anyone could answer. After that, the hum returned each dusk, soft but certain, weaving through the woods like breath beneath the leaves. And though no one said it aloud, everyone in the valley felt the same cold thought pressing against their hearts, that Harlan Doss had gone silent so that something else could learn to speak. By the first frost, the wind had begun to move strangely through the hollow. It didn't rush or whistle anymore, it carried. On certain nights, when the air was sharp enough to sting the lungs, neighbors swore they could hear a thin thread of sound drifting down from the Graverly ridge. At first it was just a hum, low and steady, the same pulse that had begun after Harlan Doss vanished. But soon the tune shaped itself into something recognizable, the slow draw of syllables rising and falling, forming a name. Harlan. The word came soft, drawn out, like breath across glass. Some heard it once and turned away. Others, too curious or too stubborn, lingered until the sound tangled in their thoughts like cobwebs. No one went up to check. The valley grew uneasy. Dogs refused to leave their porches at night, whining toward the woods. Mothers hushed children before they could ask why the hills were singing. The men spoke little of it, though 1 or 2 took to sleeping with their boots on, as if the song might decide to move closer before dawn. Even the creek seemed quieter, its water slipping by without sound. And always, when the wind shifted just right, that voice would rise, a girl's voice, light and trembling, repeating a name that no one dared answer. It was around this time that Ruth Graverly began to change. She had always been pale, but now her color seemed to drain faster than the leaves. Her hair turned white in a matter of days, and her hands shook when she poured water. Neighbors who brought food said she barely spoke above a whisper. They thought it grief, though none could say for what. The children watched her constantly, silent still but alert. their heads tilting together whenever she coughed or cried out. One woman claimed that when Ruth's fits came, the eldest girl Ada would hum softly from the corner, and the mother's trembling would stop. Not calm, exactly, but held still, like an insect pinned under glass. When Silas came to town again, his face looked older, the skin beneath his eyes gray. The storekeeper asked after Ruth, and he stood there for a long moment before saying, "She's tired. The children have found their tongues again." He said it without joy or sorrow, just a dull acceptance, as though something inevitable had finally come to pass. That evening, the wind rose hard across the ridge, bending the trees toward the valley. The song came again, stronger this time, layered with echoes that seemed to answer themselves. Some said they heard laughter within it. Others swore there were more voices now, faint but multiplying. Doors were bolted early, lamps burned late. And by morning, a fine ash had settled over the fields, clinging to windows and fences like dust from an old grave. No storm had passed through the night, but when the wind blew again, it carried words no one wished to understand. By the next spring, the Graverly place had grown into more than a home, it had become a boundary. The ridge that once divided farmland from forest now marked where courage ended. Even in daylight, people crossed themselves when passing the old path that wound up toward the cabin. The story of the singing had rooted too deep, and now it sprouted new branches with every telling. Some said the eldest Graverly child had taken to humming at the well each morning, her reflection mouthing words out of rhythm with her lips. Others whispered that Silas had stopped working the fields altogether, spending his nights beside the smokehouse with a lantern, as if guarding it or something inside from escaping. Hunters no longer climbed that slope. They said game avoided it anyway. Rabbits bolted wide. Deer tracks veered off long before the ridge, and turkeys roosted in trees far from the Graverly fence. Those who ignored the warnings came back shaken, claiming the woods near the house held a smell of metal and something sour, like breath on stone. One man swore he heard laughter there just before dusk, a sound too high to be a man's, too deliberate to be wind. It came in pairs, overlapping, as though one voice were chasing the other but never quite catching up. He never hunted those woods again. From the valley below, faint lights were sometimes seen flickering through the trees. At first, folks thought it Silas working late, mending tools or smoking meat. But the glow shifted too quickly, jumping from the house to the field, then vanishing altogether. It was as if lanterns were being carried by unseen hands. On those nights, neighbors would hear a sound like children playing a burst of laughter, sharp and wrong. The tone doubled and uneven, one voice echoing half a beat behind the other. Ruth Graverly was no longer seen in town. Some claimed she had taken to her bed. Others whispered she refused to speak at all, her mouth moving only when her children did. Silas still came for supplies, though less often, his beard unkempt, his eyes unfocused. When asked about the laughter, he said only, "They're learning." The words unsettled even the bravest of men. By midsummer, no one walked the Graverly path after sundown. Lanterns in the valley burned low, as if dimming themselves against whatever waited above. The ridge had become a wound in the land, one the townsfolk pretended not to see. But on still nights, when the air lay heavy, and even the crickets fell silent, that laughter drifted down again, thin, uneven, and far too human to be anything else. Those who heard it swore it never quite faded. It just settled in the bones and waited for dark to fall again. Reverend Amos Clay was not a man easily frightened. He had walked through fever towns and prayed over the dying in barns that stank of rot. He believed in the strength of words, God's and his own, and he carried both like weapons. When he came to the Ozarks that autumn, he heard the stories before he saw the ridge. A family whose children did not speak until the missing were named. A house that sang on windless nights. He told the congregation that silence left too long unblessed became invitation, and that he would climb the ridge himself to return the Lord's voice to the Graverly household. He arrived near dusk, lantern swinging from one hand, Bible in the other. The trail was narrow and overgrown, the light thinning until even his own footsteps sounded distant. When he reached the clearing, he paused. The Graverly house leaned forward like a thing listening. Smoke curled from the chimney, gray against the dimming sky, and from within came a faint rhythm, not words, not song, something between breath and murmur. Silas met him at the gate, gaunt and gray-eyed. The Reverend offered his hand, but Silas didn't take it. "You mean to pray for us?" he asked, voice low. Clay nodded, saying that the Lord's light had no boundary, not even here. Silas stared at him for a long moment before turning toward the door. "Then you'd best do it quick," he said. Inside, the air was warmer than it should have been, heavy with the smell of earth and tallow. Ruth sat by the hearth, her face pale beneath her kerchief. The children stood in a row beside the wall, 3 figures half lit by firelight. They did not move. They did not blink. Clay opened his Bible, reading aloud from Psalms, his voice filling the room with practiced steadiness. As he spoke, the flickering shadows behind the children seemed to shift out of rhythm with the fire. Their eyes followed him, dark and still. When he finished, he stepped forward, meaning to place his hands upon their heads. The youngest girl tilted hers slightly, as if listening for something distant. Then, without warning, a voice rose in the room, a whisper, high and soft, repeating his final line word for word, but wrong. The cadence was childish, the tone playful, but the pitch hollow, as though echoing from inside the walls. Clay froze, his breath catching in his throat. Ruth covered her mouth, eyes wide. Silas turned away. The whisper came again, clearer this time. Asterisk. Though I walk through the valley. Asterisk. It stopped, just short of the end. The fire guttered. For the first time in years, the children smiled. Reverend Clay fled before full dark. He stumbled down the trail, lantern swinging wild, and by the time he reached the valley floor, his hands were trembling too badly to hold the Bible. To the few who dared ask what he'd seen, he said only, "The Lord wasn't the only one listening in that house." He left the Ozarks before winter, but some nights, when the wind rose through the hollow, the townsfolk swore they heard a voice drifting down the ridge reciting scripture in the lilting tones of a child. The summer of the boy's disappearance was hot enough to split the bark from trees. The creeks ran shallow, the mud curling and cracking in the sun, and the air hung heavy with the smell of iron and rot. Every child in the valley found some way to cool their skin except for the Graverly children. They were never seen by the water, never seen beyond the shadow of their house. Only one boy, Samuel Beale, dared to fish the stretch of creek that wound near their ridge. He was 11, the son of a farmer whose land ran up against the Graverly woodline. He told friends he could hear humming sometimes when he fished alone, soft and low like bees trapped under glass. His mother warned him to stay away. He laughed and said it was only the wind. The last morning he was seen, Samuel left before sunrise, rod in hand, his pockets full of worms and biscuits. By noon, his father noticed he hadn't returned for dinner. By dusk, the horsemen were riding out with lanterns. They found his tracks along the creek bed, barefoot impressions, circling the same pool over and over, and his fishing pole laid neatly against a rock, lying still in the water. A few feet downstream, tangled in a snarl of roots, they found his straw hat. The brim had been torn clean through, as if by a hand that gripped too hard. The searchers fanned out, calling his name until the echo folded back on itself. No answer came, only the sound of the creek moving sluggishly beneath the fog. That night, the Beals' house burned lamps in every window. The mother wept until her voice was gone, and the father sat staring at the door, as if expecting the boy to step through at any moment. The valley watched with quiet dread. No one said it aloud, but all eyes turned toward the ridge. At dawn, Mrs. Cole, who had the misfortune of living closest, rose early to fetch water. She paused when she heard whispering by the Graverly well. 2 voices, faint but clear, speaking in perfect rhythm, word for word. She crept closer, heart hammering, and saw the Graverly twins standing side by side. Their faces were pale in the morning light, their mouths moving together as though rehearsed. The words were soft, but she caught the name between them, Samuel, spoken gently, almost tenderly, as if they were coaxing it into being. Mrs. Cole fled before they saw her. Later, when she tried to tell what she'd heard, her story tangled itself in fear. She swore the voices were not echoes, not tricks of wind, but true harmony, each child speaking a half of the same thought. That afternoon, Silas Graverly was seen repairing the fence by the creek. His face was blank, his hands steady. When a neighbor asked if he'd heard about the missing boy, he said only, "The children already have." From that day on, the valley grew quieter. Children were kept close to home. The Graverly twins were never seen playing, but sometimes, from far down the road, people swore they could hear a murmur rise from the ridge, two voices speaking in tandem, one word looping endlessly between them. The name Samuel, fading slowly into the wind. It was a late summer evening when Ruth Graverly came stumbling down the ridge, barefoot and wild-eyed, her shawl half falling from her shoulders. Mrs. Cole saw her first, a pale figure moving through the heat shimmer, her steps uneven as if she were dragging the weight of something unseen. By the time Ruth reached the gate, her face was slick with sweat, and her hands trembled so violently she could barely lift the latch. She asked for water, though her lips looked too dry to swallow. Mrs. Cole, startled but kind, guided her inside, laid her on the parlor couch, and pressed a cool cloth to her forehead. It was then Ruth began to speak, not in the cautious tones of a woman protecting secrets, but with the desperate clarity of one who had been silent too long. She said her children were never meant to cry, that before they were born, she had prayed for their lives to be spared. Each pregnancy had come harder than the last, and after losing 2 infants in Tennessee, she had knelt by the creek and begged for mercy. Something had answered, though not in words. She said the air had gone still, the trees had leaned closer, and from the water rose a sound like a lullaby sung backward, soft and slow. When she felt the first child move in her belly days later, she believed it was a blessing. But blessings do not watch you in silence, she whispered, nor do they learn to smile before they learn to breathe. Mrs. Cole tried to hush her, saying fever had taken her reason, but Ruth clutched her arm, nails biting through cloth. "It listens," she said, voice cracking, "but it doesn't understand. It only repeats. It gave them back to me, but not whole. I thought prayer could teach it what to keep and what to leave behind." Her eyes darted toward the window as if afraid the words themselves would be overheard. "It learned to make children," she whispered, "but it never learned to make souls." She stayed the night in the Cole house, delirious and trembling. By morning, her fever had broken, but her mind had gone with it. She sat upright in bed, staring toward the ridge, murmuring the same phrase again and again. Asterisk. They're still learning. Asterisk. 2 nights later, the valley woke to sound. It began as a single note, low and drawn, rising from the Graverly Ridge. Then more voices joined 3, perhaps 4, folding over one another until the air seemed to vibrate. It wasn't singing, not exactly, but it carried rhythm, intent, as if language were trying to claw its way through music. The dogs howled. Lamps flickered. The Cole family huddled together as the sound climbed to a pitch that rattled dishes in their cabinets. Then, as sudden as it began, it stopped. The silence that followed felt wrong, stretched too thin. At dawn, word spread that Ruth Graverly had died in her sleep, her face turned toward the window. And though no one went up the ridge to see, every soul in the valley swore they heard the children's voices still echoing faintly, like a prayer repeated by something that had never learned the meaning of mercy. Dr. Edwin Cole arrived in the valley in the fall of 1872, his boots polished, and his coat far too fine for the mud-thick roads that led between the hills. He was a man of learning, a physician trained in St. Louis, known for his skepticism and his fascination with the odd corners of human affliction. When he first heard the story of the Graverly children of silence cured by death, of words born from vanishing, He considered it another case of backwoods superstition. Still, something in the phrasing caught him. Asterisk. Speech returning by death. Asterisk. He'd read accounts of hysteria, catatonia, shared delusion, but nothing quite like that. Curiosity was reason enough. He packed his instruments, his journals, and his certainty that reason could mend any madness. The valley received him with wary silence. At the inn, the keeper told him the Graverly Ridge wasn't a place for doctors. They don't take to visitors, he said, nor to daylight. But Cole only smiled. The human mind, he believed, invented monsters to give shape to grief. He intended to prove it. He rode up the ridge 2 days later, the path narrowing until the trees seemed to close behind him. When he reached the clearing, he noted the stillness. First, no birds, no wind, even his horse's breathing sounded too loud. The Graverly house stood gray and leaning, smoke rising from the chimney in a thin, unbroken line. Silas met him at the gate, shotgun in hand. Cole introduced himself with the calm of a man used to doors opening, not closing. "I've come to study," he said, "and to help." After a long pause, Silas nodded once and stepped aside. Inside, the air was thick, the windows shuttered against the day. Ruth was gone by then, her presence felt only in the faint scent of lavender that clung to the walls. The children stood together near the hearth, pale and motionless. Dr. Cole greeted them softly, noting the clarity in their eyes, the unnatural symmetry of their gaze. He began his questions, simple ones at first: names, ages, memories. The children said nothing. He tried coaxing, then commanding, but silence met him at every turn. It wasn't until he mentioned the boy from the creek, Samuel Beale, that the eldest girl stirred. Her lips parted. The sound that followed wasn't speech, not exactly. It was a whisper, low and wet, the syllables shaped wrong, as though someone else's mouth had formed them. "The water was cold," she said. He slipped on the roots. Cole froze, pen hovering above paper. The girl tilted her head, and another voice joined hers, the boy twin, speaking in the same tone, continuing the same thought. He tried to call his father, but the mud took his breath. Cole questioned them carefully, pressing for details. They spoke in fragments, things no one could have known. A red string on the boy's wrist, a cut across his thumb, the song he hummed to himself when the fish wouldn't bite. Each word came flat, precise, without emotion. When they finished, both children smiled faintly, as if remembering something pleasant. The doctor left the house near midnight, his notebook trembling in his hand. He would later write that the silence in that place did not feel like absence, but containment, sound held captive until it could find a mouth to borrow. His final notes were brief. Asterisk. They speak, but not as themselves. Each word is an echo, each voice borrowed from the missing. Asterisk. He left the valley the next morning, refusing the innkeeper's breakfast, his eyes gray with sleeplessness. Weeks later, his journal arrived by post at a colleague's office in Street Lewis. It ended with a single line, scrawled in uneven ink. Asterisk. If silence can hunger, the Graverly children are its feast. Asterisk. The pounding started just after midnight, a sound that rolled down the ridge, like thunder dragged through wood. Those nearest the Graverly place misses. Cole, the Beals, the old widower Rankin heard it first, a slow, deliberate rhythm that grew louder, until it rattled their shutters. It wasn't the erratic panic of hooves or storm wind. It was measured, pulsing, alive. No one dared move at first. The valley had learned that noise from the ridge meant nothing good. But when the sound refused to stop, when it grew so strong that dogs howled and hens flung themselves against their coops, a small group of men gathered their lanterns and went up the trail, rifles in hand. The air was colder than it should have been for spring. The moon hung white and still above the tree line, painting the barn in a sickly light. The pounding had ceased by the time the men reached the clearing, leaving only the steady creak of the barn door shifting on its hinges. Silas Graverly was nowhere in sight. The house stood dark, its shutters closed. From inside the barn came a smell that made one man gag before he reached the threshold: iron, rot, and something floral beneath it. They pushed the door open, and the lantern light trembled. The floor was slick with something black that shone when the light touched it. Around the edges of the room, laid in precise circles, were animal carcasses, goats, chickens, even the family's old mule, each one arranged with its head turned inward, each mouth packed tight with wildflowers from the creek bed. The petals glistened with blood. The air hummed faintly, the way it does just before lightning splits the sky. And in the center of that terrible geometry sat the Graverly children. They weren't crying or frightened. They sat cross-legged in the straw, hands resting on their knees, whispering softly to one another. The sound was wrong: two, sometimes three voices speaking at once, weaving over each other like threads. The men stepped closer, the lanterns throwing long shadows that seemed to twist on their own. Then the words became clear. Names. The missing. Each syllable uttered cleanly, carefully, as though reciting a prayer they'd practiced many times. Harlan. Samuel. Ruth. Then another none of them knew. One of the men tried to pull the boy to his feet, but the child's skin was cold and his lips moved faster, the whisper rising until it became a hum. The flowers in the animals' mouths quivered, shedding petals that scattered across the floor like ash. The air thickened. The men bolted, leaving the lanterns behind. By morning, the barn was empty. The carcasses remained, but the children were gone, found hours later sitting on the porch steps, clean, their clothes unsoiled. When asked what they'd been doing, the eldest girl only said, "Listening." The sheriff wanted to burn the barn, but Silas refused, saying it wasn't the structure that was cursed, it was what echoed inside it. That night, the valley slept poorly. The wind carried whispers again, low and layered, like children's voices playing beneath the earth. And when dawn came, the wildflowers near the creek had all turned their faces toward the ridge, though the sun rose in the other direction. The journal of Dr. Edwin Cole was found months after he vanished, wedged behind a warped drawer in the old inn where he'd once lodged. The pages were brittle, spotted with mildew, but the handwriting remained clear, precise, deliberate, the script of a man who believed documentation could hold chaos still. The first entries were clinical, almost detached. He catalogued the Graverly children's behavior with the tone of a scholar, noting the peculiar quality of their voices. Asterisk, choral phenomena. Asterisk, he called it speech, produced not by individual volition, but by something collective, as if the words themselves required more than one mouth to exist. He described how their language changed after every tragedy. When Harlan Doss disappeared, the children had begun to hum. After Samuel Beale, they whispered in tandem. Following Ruth Graverly's death, they had begun to shape sentences, fragments of thought pieced together from the missing. Each disappearance, he wrote, enlarges their lexicon. To Dr. Cole, this was evidence of shared trauma manifesting through mimicry. Yet his tone shifted the deeper he went. The precision faltered, the sentences shortened, the margins filled with sketches, rings, lines of sound waves, spirals that tightened until they became nothing but black ink pressed into paper. He noted that the children spoke differently when left alone. During the day, they were quiet, eyes following unseen movements in the corners of rooms. But at night, from behind the closed door, he heard the whispering begin, voices interlacing like woven thread, repeating not his questions but his own words. They echoed him perfectly, even his pauses, his sighs, the soft scrape of his chair against the floor. They are rehearsing, he wrote, each syllable refined until meaning itself thins. In one entry he mentioned hearing his own name spoken from the hallway while he wrote. When he opened the door, the children were already standing there, motionless, eyes glinting in lamplight. "Did you call me?" he asked. They shook their heads together, slow and calm. "Then who did?" he pressed. The eldest girl smiled faintly. "We only say what's left behind," she murmured. After that, The handwriting grew frantic. The pages blurred with half-sentences. Asterisk. Silas won't look at them anymore. Asterisk, asterisk. Voices under the floorboards. Asterisk, asterisk. Speech without lungs. Asterisk. He described hearing multiple tones emanating from a single throat. Like two instruments sharing one string. His last notes suggested panic, an unraveling of his once iron confidence. It is not learning, he scrawled. It is remembering. They remember what shouldn't have voice. The final entry trailed off. The ink dragged in a long stroke across the paper. Asterisk. They spoke my. Asterisk. Nothing followed. The next page was blank, save for faint indentations, as if the pen had pressed words the ink refused to carry. The room he had written in was left in disarray, chair overturned, lamp cold, his instruments packed as if he'd intended to leave. He never did. The valley buried his name quietly, too afraid to speak it aloud. Yet weeks later, a farmer passing near the ridge swore he heard someone calling softly through the fog. Not in fear, not in pain, but in the patient rhythm of introduction, Dr. Edwin Cole, spoken in the gentle voices of children. By the spring of 1873, the valley was thinning like breath in a dying chest. Cabins once filled with laughter now stood hollow, their windows boarded, their fields choked with weeds. Families packed what they could carry and vanished down the road before the thaw had fully come. No one waited to see if the snowmelt would bring new life. They had heard too much in the winter silence. The voices had grown bolder. They no longer clung to the ridge they roamed. It began with whispers in the woods, faint and uncertain, the kind of sound one might mistake for wind brushing against bark. But then the words sharpened, the inflection unmistakable. They came in the tones of familiar voices, mothers calling to sons, children laughing, husbands murmuring their wives' names. One night, a woman named Etta Parsons heard her dead sister calling from the tree line, the same playful lilt she'd had in childhood. Against her husband's warning, Etta stepped out onto the porch, lantern trembling in her hand. She never came back. Only the lantern was found, glass unbroken, flame still burning. After that, no one answered when they were called. The rule spread quietly among those who remained. If a voice spoke from the dark, do not listen twice. Some said the thing in the woods could not mimic perfectly, that it learned through repetition, that each time it called, it became closer to human. By summer, the nights were filled with murmured names, carried on the slow wind that rolled down from the Graverly ridge. Silas was seen less and less after those months began. Once, he had been a figure of strength, tall and broad-shouldered, his eyes keen with suspicion. Now he drifted through the creek beds like a ghost himself. Neighbors who caught sight of him said his clothes were always wet, his boots caked with mud, as though he had been walking in the water for hours. When asked what he was doing, he answered in riddles, if he answered at all. "They remember too well," he said once to a passing farmer, "and the creek won't wash memory away." Some nights, lamps burned in the Graverly house, though no one saw movement inside. The sound that rose from the ridge was softer now, less like singing and more like breathing, a deep, steady rhythm that carried across the hollow and settled into the chests of those who heard it. The few who still lived nearby claimed it made sleep impossible, that dreams took on the shape of the voices. Children spoke of hearing names whispered beneath their pillows. By autumn, even the animals had left. The valley was silent except for the creek and the low hum that never ceased. Travelers who passed through said the land felt wrong, as if it was waiting for something. In the distance, they sometimes caught a glimpse of a figure standing knee-deep in the water, staring down at his own reflection long after the sun had gone. Those who dared to look twice swore the reflection moved first, its mouth forming words before the man above it ever spoke. By the winter of 1874, the valley's fear had ripened into something harder, something close to hatred. Those who remained no longer spoke of saving the Graverly family or of pity for what might have afflicted them. Pity had burned away long ago, replaced by a dull conviction that the only way to cleanse the hollow was through fire. The house, they said, was the heart of it, the vessel that kept whatever curse had taken root alive. So one night, beneath a sky red with frost, 6 men gathered with torches and kerosene. They swore to one another that no harm would come to them so long as they acted together, that God himself would guide the flame. The climb up the ridge was silent save for the shuffle of boots and the slosh of the oil tins. The Graverly house rose ahead like a skeleton, its windows black, its porch sagging. No smoke curled from the chimney, no light showed within. The men stood a moment, their breaths steaming, their resolve trembling just beneath the cold. Then one of them, the sheriff's cousin, a man who'd buried his brother after the voices called him into the woods, stepped forward and splashed the first arc of kerosene across the siding. The others followed, circling the house, drenching the warped boards until the smell of oil cut sharp through the night air. When the first torch touched the wall, the flame leapt high and bright and then died. It didn't hiss or spread or fade. It folded inward, like a breath drawn back into the throat of the wood. The men tried again, striking matches, tossing burning rags against the eaves. Each spark met the same fate, a flare, a shudder, and then nothing. The house remained cold, its boards slick and untouched, as if coated in some invisible dampness. The wind didn't stir. The air itself seemed to refuse ignition. Then came the sound from inside. At first it was faint, almost a murmur beneath the men's ragged breathing. But it grew, swelling with the rhythm of a heartbeat, the soft, synchronized whispering of children. It moved in patterns, rising and falling, their tones overlapping until the words were indistinguishable. The cadence was almost holy, layered like prayer, though no one could bear to call it that. Through the shuttered windows, light began to flicker, not from fire, but from within an amber glow pulsing in time with the voices. One of the men swore he saw them then. The 3 children standing behind the glass, eyes open and reflecting the lantern light, mouths moving in perfect unison. He dropped his torch and stumbled backward, shouting for the others to run. The glow swelled once more, and the whispering ceased all at once, cut clean like a knife through song. By the time the men reached the base of the ridge, the night had gone still again. The torches burned freely in their hands, mocking them with ordinary flame. When they turned back, the house loomed untouched, not a single scorch mark on its walls. In the morning, the kerosene still stained the soil, but the wood was dry and pale as bone. The valley took the failure as an omen. Whatever lived in that house, it could not be burned, and those who tried had only fed it more fear to feed upon. From then on, no one spoke of fire again. They let the house stand, and the voices, faint but constant, kept whispering long after the men had sworn never to return. They found Silas Graverly on a gray morning in early spring, when the frost still clung to the fence posts, and the fog refused to lift from the hollow. It was old Tom Rankin who went up first, sent by the preacher to check if the ridge had gone quiet after the winter storms. The Graverly house stood as it always had, its porch sagging, its shutters hanging loose like eyelids half closed in sleep. The door was unlatched. Inside, the air was still, heavy with a sour dampness that clung to every wall. Silas sat in his chair near the hearth, boots planted firmly on the floorboards, hands folded in his lap. His eyes were open, staring toward the cold fireplace, as though waiting for something to spark. There was no sign of struggle, no mark upon him, only that faint, unnatural smile fixed at the corners of his mouth. Rankin said it looked almost peaceful, but not rightly so, like a man who had seen something terrible and mistaken it for grace. The firewood beside him was dry, untouched for weeks. The lamp on the table had burned itself down to nothing. The rest of the house was empty. The beds still made, dishes stacked neatly, the children's clothes folded on the trunk by the door. Their absence felt loud, the rooms echoing with a kind of hush that pressed against the ears. Outside, Rankin found footprints in the soft earth leading away from the porch, 3 sets, small and bare. The prints wound through the yard, across the patch of dead grass, and down toward the tree line. At the edge of the woods, they split and rejoined, looping in small circles, as though the children had danced or hesitated before moving on. The trail led all the way to the creek. There, the prints deepened in the mud and stopped, vanishing at the water's edge. The current was slow, barely enough to stir the leaves gathered along its banks. Rankin knelt and touched the surface. It was warm, unnaturally so, the kind of warmth that doesn't belong to morning or season. He drew his hand back quickly, his skin tingling as though the water had pulsed beneath his palm. They searched for days, combing the woods and dragging the creek, but found no sign of the children. Not a scrap of cloth, not a single hair. On the third night, those who camped near the water claimed they heard a faint humming rising from beneath the surface. It wasn't the rush of current or the cry of frogs. It was soft, deliberate, 3 tones weaving together, the same rhythm that once carried from the ridge at dusk. When morning came, the humming stopped, and the creek ran cold again. The men left the ridge, refusing to speak of what they'd heard. The Graverly house stood silent, its door swaying open in the wind, the chair still by the hearth, Silas still sitting, as if waiting for someone to return. In the valley below, the people no longer spoke the family's name. They had become a memory wrapped in fear, and fear, like the warm current in that creek, had a way of moving beneath the surface, quiet, constant, never gone. After the Graverly children vanished, the valley changed in ways that no one could rightly describe. It wasn't simply quiet, it was emptied. The silence had weight to it. Like fog, you could breathe but not shake. Even the natural world seemed to bow under it. Birds stopped nesting near the ridge, and the ones that strayed too close flew off abruptly, wings beating in frantic bursts until they vanished over the hills. The creek, once loud enough to hear from the farms below, dulled to a trickle, as though its current moved through wool. Trees that used to whisper in the wind stood motionless, their branches stiff and unmoving even when the clouds raced overhead. Those who remained in the valley learned that sound behaved differently there. A man could shout across his field, but his own echo would die before reaching his ears. Even footsteps softened, as if the soil itself swallowed the noise before it could spread. Hammers struck wood without resonance, doors closed without thuds, and laughter, if anyone dared, it died almost before it began. People whispered when they spoke of it, though there was no one left to overhear. The air felt heavy, almost listening, as if the land had learned something from the Graverly house and was now keeping it. Travelers passing through felt it too. Some said the silence pressed on the chest, making breath come shallow. Others spoke of headaches, of the strange sensation that someone was speaking just behind them in a tone too low to hear. A peddler claimed that when he dropped his walking stick, the sound didn't hit his ears until several seconds later, and when it did, it wasn't quite right. It came warped, as if played backward. He left the next morning and refused to cross the valley again. In time, the locals began to treat the stillness as a living thing. They closed their doors early, refused to call to one another across the fields, and taught their children not to sing outdoors. They said the land could learn new sounds, just as the Graverly children had learned voices. Some swore that if you shouted your name into the woods, it would come back, changed, drawn out, split in two, like 2 mouths, trying to pronounce it at once. Only during storms did the valley stir. When the thunder rolled low and rain swept across the ridge, faint voices rose with the wind names spoken in a tone too soft to catch, repeated again and again until lightning split the sky. The sound carried through the hollow like a haunting refrain, and though no one could ever make out the words, each listener swore that one of the names felt strangely familiar, as if it had once belonged to them. When the storm passed, the silence returned thicker than before, sealing itself over the valley like earth over a grave. The story might have faded altogether, if not for a man named Nathaniel Acker, a folklorist who came through the Ozarks in the summer of 1892. He was a small, sharp-eyed scholar from Virginia, the sort who believed every superstition held a kernel of truth hidden beneath its rot. He'd spent years collecting tales from remote towns, ghost marriages, phantom miners, the curses of lost covenants, and when he reached the Graverly Valley, he thought he'd found nothing more than another hollow filled with silence and old fear. But the quiet there was different, and he sensed it the moment he stepped off his horse. It wasn't the stillness of peace or abandonment, it was the silence of something listening. The locals were reluctant to speak, but time had softened their fear into weary resignation. The valley was nearly empty by then, its cabins sunken and its fences half-rotted. Those who remained were gray-haired and stooped, living like exiles from their own memories. Acker went door to door with his small leather journal, asking about the Graverly name, about the family on the ridge, about the night the barn filled with whispers. He expected fragments, but what he gathered was closer to confession. Old Mrs. Cole, her eyes milk-white with age, told him of the mother who came fevered in the dark, whispering of bargains struck before birth. A retired preacher described his visit to the house, the way his own sermon had come back to him in a child's voice. Others spoke of lights that wouldn't burn, of laughter that echoed out of time, of animals found arranged like offerings. Each account came with tremors of the same memory voices rising from silence only when death had touched the valley. Acker filled his pages with the details, cross-referencing them against the surviving notes of Dr. Edwin Cole, which he found preserved in a church trunk. The handwriting matched what the preacher had said. Words layered, borrowed, repeated. By the time he left, the folklorist had given the legend a name that would outlive the valley itself. He called them the Echo Children. He wrote that they were beings whose language is bought in the currency of another's breath, whose mouths are not their own but borrowed from the stillness left behind. He theorized that they were not spirits in the holy sense, nor creatures of flesh alone, but something born from the hunger of silence, a kind of resonance that grew stronger each time a voice was lost to it. Acker's essay was published in a small academic journal the following year. Few read it, fewer believed it. But among those who studied it, a single line stood out, copied and whispered, until it took on a life of its own. Asterisk. They do not speak to the living, only through them. Asterisk. In the decades that followed, that phrase attached itself to every retelling of the Graverly story. And though Acker returned east and never again visited the hollow, he carried with him the unease of a man who had once stood in a place where echoes did not return, and yet still heard his own voice, faint and doubled, answering back. The journal of Miss Clara Wynne was found in the ruins of the old one-room schoolhouse that stood at the edge of the Graverly Hollow, its pages warped from damp and years of neglect. The first entries were bright with the optimism of someone newly arrived, filled with descriptions of wildflowers along the fence lines and the soft amber light that fell through the valley in the early mornings. She had come from Kansas City in 1911, a young woman eager to make her own mark, hired by the county to reopen the school that had been empty for more than a decade. The locals warned her that the hollow was a quiet place, and that the children she would teach were different. She took it for small-town superstition, smiled politely, and began her work. Her early notes were hopeful but puzzled. She wrote that the children were polite to the point of strangeness, answering questions with nods or brief, clipped words. They did not laugh, even at her light-hearted lessons. When she led them in morning recitations, their voices were so soft she could scarcely hear them. Then came the humming. It began in the second week. At first, she thought it was an absent-minded tune, one child murmuring to himself while he worked. But soon the others joined, low and steady, the sound weaving together until it filled the room. The melody had no clear shape, but its rhythm was uncanny, each child keeping perfect pace without glancing at the others. It is like a hive, she wrote, a single thought moving through many mouths. She tried to stop it, clapping her hands, shouting their names, but the hum continued, unbroken. When it finally ceased, the room fell into such stillness, she said she could hear her own heartbeat echo. The next day, during roll call, she noticed something odd. Several of the children were whispering to themselves, repeating names that weren't on her list, names she didn't recognize. When she asked, one little girl smiled and said, "They used to sit here before." Clara laughed it off at first, thinking it a childish fancy, and wrote later, "The imagination in this place is deep as the roots in the hills." 2 weeks later, a boy named Joseph failed to appear for class. His mother came at dusk, asking if he'd stayed late to help. He hadn't. A search turned up nothing. No footprints, no sign he'd ever left home that morning. The following day, when Miss Wynne read the roll, the children hummed again, louder this time. Between the notes, she thought she heard them murmur his name, stretched and drawn, as if they were tasting it. That night she wrote by candlelight, her handwriting shaking so violently that the ink ran down the page. Her final entry ended without signature, just one trembling line pressed deep into the paper. Asterisk. They're speaking again. Asterisk. The journal ends there. The schoolhouse closed within the month, its door left swinging in the wind. Locals said that in the years that followed, if one passed through the hollow near dusk, you could hear faint voices from inside, children's voices, humming the same shapeless tune, their rhythm unbroken, their words lost beneath the sound. The man's name was Walter Hensley, a tinkerer more than an engineer, the kind of curious soul who spent nights surrounded by wires, lenses, and half-finished inventions. In the summer of 1935, he came to the Ozarks chasing stories of the valley that swallowed sound. He had read about it in a defunct folklore quarterly, a passing reference to the Graverly Hollow and its strange quiet. To Hensley, that silence was not superstition but science, something in the terrain perhaps, some geological quirk that might distort airwaves or trap vibration. He brought with him a wagon of equipment, a portable transmitter, 2 wax, cylinder recorders, and enough curiosity to bury any caution. He set up camp near the ruins of the Graverly home. By then, the house was little more than bones, stone chimney still standing, porch collapsed, the walls half reclaimed by ivy and time. The locals told him he wouldn't record anything there, that the valley did not take kindly to being listened to. Hensley laughed and told them that every silence carried a sound if you listened long enough. The first night, he let the recorder spin while he slept. The cylinder hissed with static and wind. Nothing unusual. On the second night, a storm moved through. Rain struck the hollow in uneven bursts, and thunder rolled low across the ridge. Hensley set his second recorder near the creek, curious to see how the acoustics shifted. When he retrieved the cylinder the next morning, he found its surface oddly warm to the touch, as though it had been left near a flame. He didn't think much of it until he played it back. At first, all he heard was hiss, then something beneath it, faint and rhythmic, voices. They came in pairs, overlapping, the tones neither high nor low but caught somewhere between, as if 2 speakers were sharing one throat. He adjusted the speed, slowed the crank, leaned close. Words began to emerge, half-syllables, breathy vowels, and among them, names. He recognized one, then another. Names he'd copied from old church ledgers in the nearby town, people gone missing generations before. Hensley froze. He reversed the cylinder by instinct, letting the grooves unwind backward, and what came out chilled him to the bone. The voices did not distort or blur. They grew clearer. Each name spoken perfectly, one after another, punctuated by the faint scrape of what sounded like laughter. He stopped the machine, hands shaking, and wrote a single line in his notebook. Asterisk, the air remembers. Asterisk, that night, he dug a shallow hole near the chimney's remains and buried the cylinders in it, sealing the dirt tight, as if hiding something alive. The next morning, he left without breaking camp, abandoning his tent, his tools, his notes. When a farmer found his wagon weeks later, the only thing inside was that notebook, pages damp and curling, the last words pressed hard enough to tear through the paper. Asterisk, never play them again. Some sounds do not fade, they wait. Asterisk. The research team arrived in late autumn when the trees of the Ozarks stood bare and the wind scraped through their branches like fingers over bone. They came with cameras, digital recorders, thermal scanners, the trappings of modern inquiry dressed in skepticism. The leader, Dr. Halperin, was a folklorist from the state university. The others were students chasing their theses and a thrill. The valley welcomed them with stillness. The air was thin, the kind of quiet that dulls even the sound of one's own breath. They found the place exactly as the old reports described. The foundation stones of a cabin sunken into the ground, moss, covered and cold. The remnants of a chimney leaning at an impossible angle, the creek murmuring low beyond the brush. They set up their camp near what had once been the Graverly hearth. As dusk bled into night, the group recorded baseline readings. Nothing. No strange interference, no distortion, just the ordinary hiss of wind brushing through dry leaves. Dr. Halperin gave his usual lecture for the camera, explaining that legend trumps geography, that stories leave scars longer than architecture. His words floated into the dark and dissolved like smoke. When they played back the footage later, his voice trailed off mid-sentence, cut clean by a gap of silence too perfect to be a malfunction. By midnight, the air had grown heavy. The wind had died entirely. Even the creek seemed to hold its breath. The students huddled close to the equipment, their laughter brittle with nerves. One of them, an audio technician named Marie, pressed her headset tighter and frowned. "There's something under the noise," she said. She turned up the gain. Through the speakers came a faint sound, not quite human but shaped like speech, low and deliberate. Then, clearer, two voices, childlike, unmistakably speaking in tandem, their tones hollow as if echoing through water. The words came slow, overlapping. "Who's gone missing?" The group fell still. The question repeated, softer the second time, the syllables bending together until the words dissolved into a hum. The temperature dropped. One student swore he saw the ground shiver near the stones, though no wind moved the grass. They tore off the headsets and shut down the recorders, but the sound did not stop. It lingered faintly in the air itself, vibrating like the aftertaste of a struck bell. Then, all at once, it ceased. When dawn came, they played back the audio. What they heard was worse than memory. The children's voices were there again, faint but distinct, whispering beneath the static. This time, the words had changed. "Who's gone missing?" they asked once more, followed by a pause and then, softly, "You have." The team left before sundown, abandoning their tents and half their gear. Weeks later, when the recordings were analyzed in a lab, every track contained that same faint hum beneath the silence, pulsing in rhythm with their own voices. And in the final seconds of every file, just before the cutoff, came that doubled whisper again. Quiet, patient, and certain. Asterisk. "Who's gone missing?" Asterisk.